Welcome back to the program. If you're just joining us, this is your favorite Pan-African show, Bottomline Africa, right here on KTN News. Now, in November 2017, the city of Bonn will host a global dialogue on climate with the main focus of hammering out the nitty-gritty details of the Paris Climate Agreement's rulebook. Now, while much emphasis has been placed on the well below 2 degrees centigrade global warming target, it is the other landmark achievements in the 2015 treaty that now have to be cast into applicable rules to ensure that the key climate targets are reached. The rulebook will have to include details of the requirements of the nationally determined contributions that outline the climate change mitigation efforts of all parties to the agreement. They're due to be handed in every 5 years. The meeting is also meant to formalize the way countries measure and report their progress towards achieving the climate action goals and the support that developed countries provide to developing countries. And to discuss this topic tonight, let me reintroduce our guest once again. We have Maimuna Kabetesi. Ms. Maimuna Kabetesi is the Advocacy Officer, Climate and Energy at HIVOS. We also have Peter Odhengo. Mr. Peter Odhengo is an environmental scientist. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Maimuna, let me start with you. And we've talked about the Paris Agreement just a few seconds ago. And what are these agreements about? I believe it was in the year 2015. Have countries honored them?
Well, the thing is that the countries have made the agreement, they've made the commitment to keep the world's temperature from not going, the world's temperature rise from not going beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, what the countries are focusing on is getting all the other things together, as you said. Of course, the financing is the most important because climate vulnerable countries, Kenya, of course, we are one of them, are also tend to be the low emitters. So we are most vulnerable, but we are not the ones that cause the problems. So now all the... Yes?
Yes. Now, Mr. Peter, this is where I want to bring you in. Speaking about financing, when this Paris Agreement was being crafted in France, you remember the US withdrew from that agreement thanks to their President Donald Trump. And the US remains to be one of the countries, major financiers to Africa, if I can put it that way. Has that affected in any way the continent?
Great. It is unfortunate that the U.S. Indicated that they will be pulling out, but as of now, they have not formally pulled out of the Paris Agreement, although they have already deposited their instruments indicating that they will pull out. But indeed, the U.S. is always one of the major, has been one of the major funders in most of the climate finance, and according to their Paris Agreement and the commitments that they pledged, of about $3 billion US, of which they had already committed $500 million and another $500 million. So definitely there will be a gap if they pull out within the Paris Agreement. But nevertheless, other countries which are also committed, like EU and other blocs, are also trying and coming up with proactive actions to enable them to meet the gap in the case US finally pulls. Although it will take a long time, but also but we need to be prepared that suppose they move out as they have indicated, then definitely we'll have a shortfall, and that will have a significant effect, particularly on poor countries, Africa in particular, and also Kenya can also be affected.
Now, Mr. Peter, Africa is known to contribute less to global warming, to climate change, but it affects Africa the most. So, from your own observation, can Africa afford to rely on these developed countries, who have been, at the forefront when it comes to contributing to global warming? Don't you think that Africa also has to come up with its own way of financing ways, in ways of mitigating climate change?
It is true that Africa cannot rely on these development partners or our partners outside. And it is also true that Africa is also doing a lot to ensure that they have resources that they can put for themselves to mitigate and build resilience and adapt to the impact of climate change, which is currently is the biggest elephant in the room. However, as you are aware that most of the African countries are poor and are not able to meet their basic obligations, it is indeed a challenge. And as you're aware, for example, the US, which is the main contributor of greenhouse gas emission, contributing more than 25%, followed by the recently developing, fast developing country like China. They have a responsibility. They have, it's just like a human right that they have to sort the mess that they cause. So while we are trying to put significant resources which are scarce, definitely internationally they have to contribute towards making Africa and poor countries.
So, Mr. Peter, you're saying actually now there are African countries who have put money aside in their budget to mitigate climate change?
Great. A number of African countries are putting a significant budget within their budget, public expenditure budgets, because it is one of the requirements within the national determined contribution as deposited with the United Nations framework, climate change framework, convention framework, as part of the Paris Agreement. And it is also it's a key requirement as part of the co-financing, whether it is voluntary or binding, that they have commit resources to also complement the resources from outside. And I know that if you look at the trajectory over the last 5 years, African countries have been doing their best. They have been providing significant budgetary support. But as you are aware that in order to mitigate the impact of long-term climate change, we really need significant resources. Recent studies put aid as about over $390 trillion, which we require over the next 15 years to lower the temperature slightly below 2 degrees, and that's only in significant sectors. So if you look at that, such kind of resources is well way over most of African continent. But for example, in Kenya here, Kenya is on the lead, and Kenya is doing very well. And Kenya is a country that is now being talked about globally, because we are leading in terms of the public resources being put to accelerate and to enable also the private sector within the country to come in and chip in building the resilience, adapting to impacts of climate change, and also show the way that, yes, it is a problem. We cannot continue arguing with the others who have resources and may not come to our aid in the
Of course, getting resources is key. Now, Ms. Maimuna, there are those who are in denial. You know, they're against climate change. They're saying this is just scientific and it's not something that is practical. Yeah. How does this kind of attitude affect, initiatives meant to mitigate climate change?
I think the great thing about the progresses we've made in science and the willingness that people have to investigate the science, which they didn't maybe before, is that more and more people are accepting. These days, even if you Google climate deniers and you see what they're talking about, they are actually not saying that climate change doesn't exist, but what they're disputing is the effects of climate change. So to be honest, the global community as a whole, I would say, apart from very few outliers, we are 100% on the path that climate change exists, and we need to find ways to mitigate and to adapt to climate change now before it's too late.
And of course, once again, the US pulled out of the Paris Agreement, thanks to the president, who's also one of the climate change people who deny climate change. They say that is not in existence. So how has that affected initiatives meant to mitigate climate change in the continent?
I think, as my friend Peter said, the US has said that they will pull out, but they haven't yet pulled out. And it's also not that quick to pull out of the Paris Agreement. A country cannot wake up tomorrow and say, I'm out, and then they're done. For the US to completely pull out of the Paris Agreement would take 3 years at least of continuous action. And then I think the other important thing to note is that, of course, while the US pulled out, there is states within the US, which is a federal nation, who have said, we are firmly on the side of the Paris Agreement. We are still committed to this path. So while it was a big blow in the beginning, I think there's countries which are adjusting. China has stood up and said, we will do what the US will not. I think it's actually put everyone else in a position where we're saying, well, if we have to continue without them, then so be it. But of course, at the same time, we hope that they don't withdraw fully, because it's necessary for the globe to act together on this.
Mr. Peter, of course, research indicates that Africa's push for development continues, and key to that is access to electricity. At this moment, more than 600 million people in Africa cannot still get access to electricity. So how can the challenge of avoiding, these rising in carbon emissions, also pushing access to clean energy, be resolved?
Definitely. The debate about climate change started almost over 20 years ago. And as the debate was going on, definitely technology scientists have also been moving toward to provide a solution for the market to shift from carbon-intensive economy to a clean energy sources, which we now have. If you look at the cost of solar 5 years ago, it was perceived as one of the most expensive sources of energy. It was also perceived that it is still very expensive. But today, the cost of solar energy is at par with these normal conventional power sources like oil. So it means that advancements in science, technology, and production processes and consumption is moving faster than the skeptics. And it is now possible that the 600 million people in Africa can access clean energy without necessarily having these expensive national grids, which take long to be constructed. Indeed, now the more talk in the village is about solar off-grid system, which is now at par and can provide sustainable clean energy in affordable manner. And as such, it is not only solar. If you take also the trajectory on the wind energy aspect, the wind has also been now demystified, and there are these big farms like what we have in the Turkana, Loyangayali, but there are also simple, compact wind turbines which can now be put within this single the premises or within homes.
Yes.
Now, there are also biomass, because as you are aware that more than 70% of the population, for example, here in Kenya is still using biomass. And biomass technology has also advanced. If you look at the alternative technology and products like the production of briquettes, which can now be effectively put to replace charcoal and firewood, things are moving towards direction. But we need to accelerate them. And it is this acceleration that developing countries, particularly Africa, will be pushing, that more resources need to be available. Those technologies must be accessible. The issues of patents must be removed so that the poor people can access these technologies and these resources which are now available.
Yes. Now, Maimuna, Peter has talked about, several projects, solar energy projects in Kenya and in Africa as well, wind projects, especially the one that is still shaping up in Turkana. But there are those who come from the school of thought, that, these industries that are based in these African countries are normally driven by, energy from coal or, fossil energy. So where will that leave the environment?
I think it's actually maybe not so accurate to say that we are being led by, I think you said fossil energy. Actually, in Africa, you find that a lot of our energy comes from renewable energy. For instance, in Kenya, we have a lot of energy coming from hydro, which is a renewable source. And then we have a lot of energy coming from geothermal. And we are actually the country with the largest geothermal potential in the world. What we have to try and avoid as Kenya and other countries in sub-Saharan Africa who've discovered these natural resources is a temptation to exploit these resources too much, so that we end up increasing our resources and making it harder to achieve our climate change goals. But I think that the governments are conscientious of this, and they're aware as well of the pitfalls of fossil fuels, as we all are. And it's my hope that we'll continue on a low-carbon development pathway. Yeah.
Now, Peter, as I've earlier indicated, Africa is the least emitting in terms of, greenhouse gas emissions. So from an African point of view, do you think African countries are getting enough support from these developed countries?
Not really, not really. If you look at the flow of climate finance over the last 3 years, you find that more than 80% of those resources are flowing to East Asia and also Western Europe. And Africa gets a paltry less than 14%. That means that Africa, which is highly impacted by climate change, is not getting the resources that it needs. But that has also been as a result that Africans don't have policies and legislative frameworks and enabling environment to attract those low carbon investments. However, that over the last 5 to 10 years has been changing. But unfortunately, the flow of climate finance in the continent is still very low compared to South America. Just imagine Brazil is attracting more than what all African 54, 52 countries are getting in. China, which is now the heaviest polluter, is also attracting so much climate finance again. So we need to do more. We need to create awareness. We need to reinterrogate our enabling environment, because the main chunk of money is going through the private sector, and it is financing the renewable energy sources. My colleague Mwamona just talked about geothermal. Geothermal, for example, in Kenya, has been receiving significant support, but you know it takes some time for it to be, the wells to be generated and the power to be taken through the grave. But true, we need more.
Exactly, more needs to be done. I think that will serve as your final comment, Mr. Peter. There now, Maimuna, as you make your final comment, there are those who would like to know how gender is linked to climate change, perhaps.
Yes, I think that's a really good, really good query. And what I can say is that, for instance, we've just been talking about how the poorest countries are the most affected by climate change. When we look at our populations, and I think it's important to stress, it's not just gender that we talk about, but gender is really an important factor in who is affected more by climate change. In this case, women tend to be affected more by climate change. For instance, we've been talking about energy. The lack of energy disproportionately affects women. We can see that in Kenya because some of the home burdens that come are expected to be done by women. The fetching of firewood takes up the time of women and school children. We also see that women may be the ones trying their hands at maybe subsistence farming, but they are finding that now with the climate changing, I don't know if you've ever gone to Eastern Kenya or anywhere, you'll find that people are saying it's very hard to plant now. We can't predict the rains anymore. So our crops are failing. When you've got a woman with her small house, her small chamber that she's expecting to feed her family on with the crops and maybe sell a little bit at the market and it fails, it's a very big disaster compared to someone who has acres of land. So this is what we talk about when we talk about gender in climate change. Well explained,
Maimuna. Thank you very much for your input, as well as Peter. Maimuna Kabatesi is the Advocacy Officer, Climate and Energy at Hivos. Peter Dhiengo is an environmental scientist. Many thanks, both of you, for your input. Now, over to our proverbs of the day. Of course, our proverb there comes from Malagasy tonight. Now, before we go over to our bottom line editorial, we did ask you earlier if you think that Kenyan police are using excessive force against demonstrators. Actually, on our Twitter poll, we did ask you, do you think that Kenyan police are using excessive force against demonstrators? 72% of you said yes, and 28% of you said no. Let me quickly go through a few of your feedback here. And let me just get it here for you. And at Shadi Kid says yes. Okay. At Marianne says police are using excessive force on every innocent citizen. So sad. Geoffrey Muturi says Kenya police should moderate the force in handling an armed protesters. Let me just take one more here. And Moses Otieno says, yes, they are killing innocent people. And it's only in Nyanza is asking why. Of course, keep on with the conversation and remember to always use our hashtag Bottomline Africa. And finally, here is the bottom line editorial tonight. Right now, the effects of climate change are already being felt by people across Africa. Evidence shows that the change in temperatures has affected the health, livelihoods, food productivity, water availability and overall security of the African people. Now, according to the Climate Change Vulnerability Index for 2016, 7 of the 10 countries most at risk from climate change are in Africa. Let me make it practical for you. The gradual yet dramatic disappearance of the glaciers on Mount Kilimanjaro is as a result of climate change. Now, the glaciers act as a water tower and several rivers are now drying up. It is estimated that 82% of the ice that kept the mountain when it was first recorded in the year 1912 is now gone. East Africa is facing the worst food crisis in the 21st century. Now, according to Oxfam, 12 million people in Ethiopia, Kenya, as well as Somalia are in dire need of food. Rainfall has been below average, with some of the driest years being recorded now. This is a serious problem for a continent almost entirely dependent on rain for its agriculture. For a continent that contributes the least to the carbon emissions that have contributed to climate change, we stand to lose the most. And here's another challenge. Africa's push for development continues, and key to that is access to electricity in a continent where more than 600 million people live without electricity. What we're saying is that Africa can develop and at the same time protect and sustain the environment. Finally, when US President Donald Trump announced America's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement on climate change, newly elected French President Emmanuel Macron then seized the opportunity to lecture Trump in English and implore him to, quote-unquote, make the planet great again. We all have that responsibility, and that's the bottom line tonight. Many thanks for watching. My name is Joseph Ibrahim. Remember, this program is always aired Monday to Thursday from 10 to 11 p.m. Until tomorrow, same place, same time. Bye-bye and enjoy the rest of the night.